Well, thank you very much. I'm really grateful to the Institute of Journalism for allowing me to speak here. I thank all of you for coming out. This is my second visit to Ukraine, and it's a country that I have special feelings for because I think that the democratic movement here surprised the world when it happened in 2004, and I think that that spirit is still present despite the ups and downs of democracy in Ukraine and in this part of the world in general. This summer fellows program that Svetlana Zalishchuk mentioned is one effort we make at Stanford University to bring people that believe in democracy around the world together to share their experiences and to deepen their understanding of politics and political institutions. And so I'm really delighted to be able to meet with them and with you here today. So let me explain what I am going to speak about. I wrote a book 2 years ago whose English title was The Origins of Political Order. This volume is the first of two. This one goes from Prehuman Times up into the French Revolution. And next year there will be a second volume that will take the story from the French Revolution up to the present moment. The reason I wrote this book is that political institutions are critical for any successful society. My personal interest in this came about as a result of American foreign policy because, as you're well aware, in the last decade, the United States has fought 2 wars in the Middle East, in Afghanistan and Iraq. And in both of those cases, it faced this fundamental problem of a collapsed political order, where there was not a basic set of institutions in place. And I think that Americans discovered that they didn't really know how to create institutions. And it occurred to me as a political scientist that I, in a certain sense, didn't understand where political institutions came from. I have described this in my book as the problem of getting to Denmark. Denmark is a small country, but it is a very happy one in many respects. It's democratic, it's modern, it's rich. The people there seem to be quite happy with their own situation. There's a very low level of corruption. And we would like many countries to be like Denmark, but we don't know how to make countries into Denmark. The United States, I think, largely failed to produce any Denmark-like institutions in either Iraq or Afghanistan. But I think even the Danes themselves don't really understand how they got to be Denmark because all of this was buried so much in the past. In this part of the world, in Ukraine, in Russia, in Belarus, in other places, I think the work of political institution building is far from done. I think the kinds of institutions that are needed to create a really modern and successful democratic political order, a lot of those are missing. And we're not going to understand how to produce them, I think, unless we go back a little bit in history. And so that was the origin of this book, to understand where the basic political institutions in a modern society, what their origins were and how they evolved. Now, let me start by just laying some conceptual ground so that we can understand what we mean by political development. In my view, there are really 3 important sets of institutions that really need to exist before a society can be, I think, a true modern political order. These 3 are first, the state; second, a rule of law; and third, a system of democratic accountability. So let me define each one of those in turn, because I think the understanding of what each of these is and how they operate in conjunction with each other is critical. The state is a hierarchical institution that exercises a legitimate monopoly of power. Power is critical to states. States are all about the ability to concentrate and use power to enforce laws, to enact policies, to produce basic political stability. I think that in many respects, we associate states with a kind of despotic power, that states can use that power to tyrannize over people. And that is certainly the case. But there's another sense of state power that I think is equally important. States have to produce what economists call public goods, goods like clean environment, education, law and order, public health, public infrastructure, and they have to deliver services. Modern states are expected to educate their citizens, make sure they're healthy, provide for their retirement through pensions, provide a great number of services. And I think that we wrongly associate states with the first kind of despotic power, or unfortunately, there are many states that are good at exercising that kind of despotic power, but they're terrible at providing basic services for their citizens. And so I think that actually when I speak about wanting to have a strong state, and unfortunately my book, I wrote a book in 2004 that in English is called State Building. When it was translated into Russian, the title was translated as Silnaya Gasudarstva. And unfortunately, I think a number of Russians have interpreted this as meaning that I'm approving a strong Putin-like state, and that's not what I'm talking about. When I talk about a strong state, I mean a state that is capable of producing these kinds of public benefits for the whole population in a clean and transparent way. And in fact, the great German sociologist Max Weber made a further distinction between what he called a patrimonial or a traditional state and a modern state. A traditional or patrimonial state is basically run for the benefit of the ruler, and it's staffed by the friends and family of the ruler. And all of the relationships to the state are personal in the sense that if you're not a friend of the ruling, the president or the prime minister or the king, then you have no status. You can't get justice, you can't get access to state services. And Weber said that the characteristic of a modern state is that it is impersonal, meaning you have a relationship to the state by virtue of the fact that you are a citizen. And the state tries to treat all citizens equally. It does not depend on whether you're related to the ruling elite or whether you have some inside connection. A modern state must be impersonal. And one of the biggest and most difficult transitions that any political order needs to make is that transition from a state that's based on friends and family of the ruler, to a state that is impersonal and seeks to treat its citizens on an equal basis. You don't need to be democratic to do this, but you do need to have a modern state. This is particularly difficult because I believe that it is human nature to relate to each other on the basis of friends and family. This is a biological fact that we favor our relatives and we develop social relationships on the basis of an exchange of favors. I give you something and you give me something, and then we feel a mutual moral obligation. This is the way that families work. This is the way that small communities work. But any kind of political order requires moving beyond friends and family because political orders have to be large, they have to govern large territories, and if they're dependent on this kind of biological, personal relationship, they are not going to be fair and they're not going to be successful. So in some sense, what we have to explain when we explain the development of a modern political order is something very unnatural. In a modern state, we want to hire public officials based on their ability, based on their technical knowledge, based on their education, based on their sense of fairness, and not because they're a relative of ours, not because they're a personal friend of ours. And that is what is extremely difficult, and it's something that's not been achieved in very many countries in human history. All right? So this is the first of the three elements of a modern political order, is to have not just a state, this monopoly of power, but also a modern state that is impersonal. Now, the second, I think, critical set of institutions has to do with what is called the rule of law. The rule of law is not just a matter of having laws and regulations. Those rules must apply to the most powerful people in the society if it is to be truly a rule of law. If the king, the monarch, the prime minister, the president can make up the rules as he goes along, that's not the rule of law. The rule of law is superior to the will of any particular holder of supreme office. It's superior to the people that hold the weapons and the guns and the coercive power that the state deploys. And that is the only circumstance under which you can say that there is a rule of law. And so the state, on the one hand, is about concentrating power and being able to use it to govern, but the rule of law is a constraint on power. It means that power is used only according to rules of justice that the whole community agrees upon. So on the one hand, you have one institution that uses power, and on the other, an institution that constrains it. The third important set of institutions has to do with political accountability. And I believe that in the modern world, this has to do with democracy, the rules that we come up with regarding free and fair multi-party elections in which there's access by anyone in the society to the political system, there's genuine political competition registered in periodic elections. But accountability has a deeper meaning than that. The deeper meaning is that the political rulers have to rule in the interests of the society as a whole rather than in their own self-interest. That an accountable government is accountable to the people as a whole, and that the way that we get to that is via elections. But elections are only a means to the end of substantive accountability. And in fact, there can be authoritarian regimes that are, in that sense, more accountable than others. And so I think if you compare, for example, China or Singapore, which are both authoritarian regimes, with North Korea or Zimbabwe, you'd have to say that China and Singapore are more oriented towards a kind of substantial accountability towards their citizens than North Korea or another kind of dictatorship in sub-Saharan Africa. All right? So these are the three institutions that I think have to characterize any modern society. You have the state that concentrates and uses power. You have law that limits power according to certain transparent rules. And then you have institutions of political accountability that make sure that power serves the interests of the whole community and not just of those that hold power, the elite that runs the society. And if you think about it, that's really what we mean by having a modern liberal democracy. It's this combination of state, rule of law, and accountability held in a kind of balance. And I think that what's really a miracle in a certain way is that you can have this kind of political regime at all. You want a country that is powerful enough to enforce laws, but constrained enough that it only enforces laws that are agreed upon. And that is something that is actually very hard historically to achieve. I think it's not something that's been fully achieved here in Ukraine. It's certainly not been achieved in Russia. I think despite the hopes for democratic development in all three of these areas, there's still a lot of work of political development yet to do. I don't want to come here as an American and pretend that in my country we've got all of these things right either, because I think that we have problems in our own political system. And so in a certain sense, political development and the development of political order is an ongoing struggle. Now, what I want to do is give you an overview, a historical overview of where these institutions, these three institutions, came from originally, because unless we understand the origin of these institutions, we don't really understand how in the modern world they can be generated. And the story is actually going to start with China. I think actually in many Western historical accounts, there's a certain tendency to downplay or not to understand actually global history and the fact that China was actually the first society to create a modern state. And they did this more than 2,000 years ago. This is an achievement that I think most people in the West actually don't recognize. And if you ask how the modern state came about in China, it in fact is a kind of tragic story because it came about as a result of relentless warfare. There's a famous American sociologist, Charles Tilly, who wrote about the rise of the modern state in Europe, in Western Europe, and he has this very memorable phrase, "The state makes war and war makes the state," that there is a historical connection between war-making and state-making in history, and I think the history of China really indicates this. So about 1,000 years before the birth of Christ, China, in the so-called Western Zhou dynasty, was basically a tribal society. There were perhaps 1,200 different political units in China, all run by a tribal elder or leader, all vying for political power. And then over the next 800 years, there was a gradual consolidation of these units into a smaller and smaller number of political entities, until by what the Chinese call the spring and autumn period, there were only about perhaps 15 or 16, and then by the period that the Chinese call the Warring States period, the number had fallen to 7. And in the year 221 BC, these 7 units are finally conquered by the western state of Qin. So the word China comes from Qin, from this state that succeeded in finally unifying China. And the first Qin dynasty that starts modern, in a sense, modern Chinese history is born. And the state-building process, you can see, is driven by military conflict in a very clear way. If you have to raise an army, you have to draft soldiers. And so this is one thing that the Chinese learned to do, that instead of having aristocrats riding around in chariots, they would have to draft peasants and give them weapons and training. In order to draft peasants, you had to tax, you had to have resources. In order to have resources, you had to have a civilian bureaucracy. And so the need to mobilize the society for war created the need for civilian administration. And one thing that the Chinese began to realize is that if you as the ruler appoint your cousin or your brother or some friend of yours as a general in a desperate war in which the existence of your society is at stake, and that person is incompetent, you're going to lose. And in fact, many Chinese entities, polities were simply destroyed in this period. And this is where the idea of meritocracy really first arose, this idea that if we are going to staff the government, it cannot be based on friends and family. It has to be based on talent and education. And it led to an entire ideology, which we now know as Confucianism, that was built around a doctrine of bureaucracy. The idea that certain people could rule based on their literacy, their ability to know the Chinese classics, to be able to analyze, and to be able to use those mental skills in government. And so the Chinese were actually the first to invent the civil service exam, this idea that you could not be a bureaucrat unless you had qualifications and unless you could pass a test. And in fact, you have probably noticed that the Chinese, almost anywhere they go, do very well. You know, the ones that come to Canada and the United States are very rich, they're very well-to-do, they're upwardly mobile. And the reason for that is that Chinese mothers really care about the education of their children. They put all of their family savings into sending their children to good schools. And if you ask, where does this cultural characteristic come from, this emphasis on education, it comes out of this Confucian bureaucratic system in which you could take an exam as a poor child in a poor village, and if you were smart enough to pass the exam, you could become a mandarin, you could become a senior bureaucrat, you could rise to the top of the hierarchy, and you could become one of the most powerful people in China. And so this, I think, is, in a sense, the secret that the Chinese unlocked in the year 221 BC when the state of Qin unified China as a single entity. And it has been the source of, I think, both Chinese politics and the quality of Chinese administration ever since then. If you look today at the way that China is run, the Chinese Communist Party actually bears many, many resemblances to this traditional dynastic way that China was ruled. The one thing that the Chinese are really good at is centralized bureaucratic government. Because of this long tradition that stretches back more than 2,000 years, they did this 1,800 years ago before the first modern bureaucracy was created in Western Europe. So this is really their tradition. And in fact, the Chinese, you know, they're running a country of 1.3 billion people out of a centralized authoritarian bureaucratic system. They've guided that country to economic growth that really has no historical precedent. And so they're doing something right in the course of their governing. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that I like China particularly, or that I think that this is a good system of government, because a modern state in the absence of rule of law and democratic accountability is a perfect dictatorship. And that's really what the Chinese succeeded in creating. They did this 2,000 years ago, and they continue to do that because the Chinese system is unbalanced. And in fact, the more organized and coherent and efficient that bureaucratic state is, the more tyrannical it can be. And so the Chinese have been capable of unbelievable acts of tyranny over their own citizens because they had a state in the absence of rule of law and democracy that would serve as constraints on state power. But the power of this idea of a unified state really then lasted for the next 2,000 years and gave them the concept of a national identity and a national tradition that I think is still a major asset for them up to the present. All right, so that's the state. In Europe, you had a similar military competition among Sweden, France, Germany, Prussia, prior to a unified Germany, in which that kind of military competition also played a very big role in producing modern meritocratic bureaucratic states. And this was really the history of the 17th, 18th centuries in modern Europe. All right, now, let me turn to the second of these institutions, which is the rule of law. So remember my definition of the rule of law. The rule of law is a set of rules that apply to the most powerful people in the society. Where do we see this kind of phenomena happening? And I think the answer around the world is almost always that it comes out of religion, because institutionalized religion is really the only source of moral rules that in many societies is recognized as superior to the will of the political leadership or the politically powerful elite. And indeed, in ancient Israel, in the Christian West, in the Muslim world, and in Hindu India, you had law that came not from the state, but from a hierarchy of priests, of jurists, of interpreters of the law. And that law was in theory superior to the will of the politicians. Now, there's a particular history of law in Western Europe that I think made the rule of law stronger in that region than in any other part of the world. And to understand that, you really have to go back to something that was called the investiture conflict in the 11th century that took place between the Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Emperor. So in those days, it was legal for Catholic priests and bishops to marry. And in fact, they would have children and they would turn over their benefices to their children, and they could engage in the kind of corrupt court politics that characterized European feudal society at that time. There was a great pope who eventually became Pope Gregory VII, who understood that the church would never have moral authority unless it cleaned up corruption within the church. And so the whole practice of forbidding priests and bishops to marry and to have children was not something that they found in the scripture, because in the Eastern Church that rule doesn't exist. It was a deliberate blow against nepotism. They realized that the church had to get rid of, basically if you didn't get rid of children, you wouldn't be able to get priests to pay attention to their flock and not collect money and benefits for their offspring. And so the church was reformed, and then there was a huge struggle that took place between the church and the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV over who had the right to appoint priests and bishops, because up to that point it was the secular authorities that did it. The Pope, this Pope Gregory, excommunicated the Holy Roman Emperor. He had to come to Canossa to receive absolution from the Pope, but this led to a war between the papal party and the empire that lasted for another 2 generations, at the end of which the Pope won the right to appoint the church's own priests and bishops. And in the course of this, they recovered the Justinian Code, which was a 6th century compilation of Roman law that had been sitting in an attic in northern Italy, and they taught this in a law school that they founded in the city of Bologna in northern Italy. And from that school, they trained generations of lawyers in what was to become the continental civil law tradition. Now, why am I going back 1,000 years and talking about this? Because this illustrates something very important about the law. It is not enough that the law has moral authority. The law does have to have moral authority before it's going to be obeyed. But it has to have institutional independence. If the king can appoint the jurists that administer the law, then it's not going to be the rule of law. And in Western Europe, this tradition of independence, of judicial independence, is actually very, very ancient, and it lies in the church's recovery of this ability to administer the ecclesiastical law and to hold it over secular rulers. And this is really the origins of the Western legal tradition. And so in Western Europe, there's this very deep tradition of law preceding the building of a modern state. In China, it was the opposite way, that you built a modern state and there was never any law. And in fact, China is interesting because it's the only world civilization that had no transcendental religion, and therefore nothing like the rule of law tradition that exists in other societies. And to this day, China does not have anything that we would recognize as a true rule of law that is binding on the Chinese Communist Party. Chinese Communist Party can do whatever it wants. It does not have to obey the law. And that is a pretty deep tradition in China. But in Western Europe, it was different. In Eastern Europe, the tradition was very different because there was a very close union between the leader of the Eastern Church and political authority. It wasn't universally observed, but it was a tendency to unite the power of the church with the power of the secular rulers. And so in Eastern Europe, there was a tendency, or in the Eastern Church, or the lands of the Eastern Church, the church itself never served as a strong institutional, independent bulwark and the preserver of law to the extent that it did in the West. All right? Let's move on to the last of these institutions, which is democracy. So where does democracy come from? Where does the idea that the king should be responsible to a parliament, where does that arise in history? And the answer is it arises because of the survival of a peculiar feudal institution that in France was known as the sovereign courts or the parlement, in England was known as the parliament, in Russia was known as the Zemsky Sobor, Diet in Hungary and Poland, Cortes in Spain. In every single European country in feudal times, there was an estate of elites who held the wealth of the country, and the king would have to go to these estates to request taxes. When he wanted to wage war or build a palace, he would have to get permission from the wealthy people in the society. This was a tradition that was well established in feudal law. Beginning in the late 16th and 17th centuries, a number of European monarchs began to think to themselves, well, why shouldn't I be like, why do I have to go to these parliaments? Why can't I just directly extract taxes from my people? And so there's a long period of struggle between the king and the parliament or the estates in one country in Europe after another. And in most of those countries, it was the ruler that won that struggle and created an absolutist government. This happened in France, this happened in Spain, it happened in Russia, and it happened in parts of Germany like Prussia that would become the foundation of the modern united Germany. There was only one country in which this struggle was not won by the king, and that was England. And the reason it didn't happen in England was that the side of Parliament was sufficiently strong and motivated and well organized that they actually fought the king. This was King Charles I, the Stuart monarch Charles I in the 1640s. They fought a civil war with that monarch. They actually won the civil war and they cut off this king's head. And then they went through a republican period briefly. They restored the king. But in 1688-89, because of the threat of another Catholic monarch who would tax Parliament without getting Parliament's permission, they brought a new king from Holland, or actually a new king and queen, King William and Queen Mary, from the Netherlands, and installed this new dynasty under a constitutional settlement that the English call the Glorious Revolution. Glorious Revolution is the origin of parliamentary government because it led to a legal settlement in which the king agreed to the principle no taxation without representation. The fact that the monarch had to go to parliament to get taxes was critical to the rise of modern democracy because taxes are the main lever that citizens have over the government. If the government needs your money and you can withhold it, that gives you power over the government. And in the case of England, the power on the parliamentary side was sufficiently strong that they could get the king to agree permanently to a settlement that said, I cannot raise taxes without going to you and getting permission. And this is the origin of accountable government. And furthermore, it was connected with a revolution in ideas because the great English philosopher John Locke was living in Holland at the time. He went to England. He wrote the second treatise on government in which he said, legitimate government is based on consent of the governed. less than 100 years later, the American colonists in North America would launch a similar revolution against another English king. And what were the two slogans of that revolution? They were, first, government legitimacy rests on consent of the governed, and second, no taxation without representation. And I think that this connection between taxation and parliamentary government shows you why it's very bad to have natural resources. Because if you're a country, like a certain unnamed big country sitting north of Ukraine, that has a lot of gas and oil, and where the government actually can get a lot of money just because it comes out of the ground, you know, without terribly much effort, they don't have to tax their citizens. They can actually just distribute the rents from these natural resources without citizens having that leverage over them that historically they had in places like England and America. And so, in a sense, the American Revolution of 1776 of Thomas Jefferson and the American Founding Fathers flowed directly out of this conflict in England less than 100 years later, and it established the basic principles of modern, democratic, accountable government. So as I said, this is really the modern synthesis, where on the one hand you need a state. You have to have a state that can deliver peace, order, security, public services, public goods, but you also need the state that is constrained by law, by a rule of law, and by public accountability. And the whole reason I've now gone through this whole exercise in history, from China up until the Glorious Revolution, is to show you actually that getting to Denmark, you know, this problem that I posed at the beginning of my talk, getting to Denmark is actually a pretty difficult struggle. It's pretty difficult to get to a modern state rather than a patrimonial or a patronage-based state. It's pretty hard to establish independent legal institutions, and it's pretty hard to get to democratic accountability because each one of these sets of institutions had a very specific historical origin in human history, and it's kind of an accident, or you might say it's a providential miracle, that all of these came together in a place like England or in the United States. But once it came together, it was such a successful formula. You know, the idea that the state could not tax its citizens without their permission, that property rights were sacrosanct, that you needed a modern state that was able to be impersonal in the way it treated its citizens. This proved to be the basis of a tremendous amount of economic growth. So England and America together became the fastest growing industrializing countries when the Industrial Revolution then broke out. And I think that one of the reasons that this combination of institutions is so widely imitated around the world is because it is the political foundation for modern prosperity. Without legally protected property rights, it is very difficult for people to invest, for people to trade with each other with confidence that they won't get cheated, that the state will not appropriate their land, their property arbitrarily. So this is a winning formula, and I think this is why around the world today there are probably 110, 120 countries that at least aspire to be democracies. They hold elections and they have some semblance of law despite the fact that they've got very imperfect institutions. Now, I want to end up just with the following projection into the future. I've not published the second volume of the book, and in many ways some of the conclusions are going to have to wait for that. But over the last 10 years, I would say that things have not gone well for liberal democracy in the world, and things have actually gone pretty well for authoritarian government. The United States, I think, made some big foreign policy mistakes in the Middle East, and then it suffered a financial crisis in 2008. Europe is undergoing a big crisis of the euro because of the poor design of the eurozone, and is now mired in high unemployment, especially youth unemployment, and slow growth. And in the meantime, China has zoomed ahead with historically unprecedented growth rates for a country of that size. And so I think many people around the world are saying, look, China model and Singapore, maybe before that, show that democracy is really not all that important to be a successful society. That actually this formula that I talked about, having state, rule of law, and accountability, may not be the winning formula after all. Maybe we need a more Chinese-style, state-driven form of government. And look, I can't predict the future, so I don't know what the world... In fact, somebody asked me that as I was walking into this school. Yes, a student asked me this, what was the world going to look like? And I mumbled something, but the truth of the matter is I don't know what the world is going to look like in 50 years. But I do think that there are good reasons to think that the China model is not going to survive, and that something like liberal democracy, as I've defined it, is going to be the more durable institution. Because the China model, apart from the fact that their economic model is simply going to run out of steam as they try to become a high-income country, is too unbalanced. It's too unbalanced. It has state, but it doesn't have the constraints on the state. And as societies generate middle classes of educated people, people like yourselves that read, that are connected by technology to the rest of the world, that have a certain amount of wealth that the state can take away, they want political participation. And I don't think this is a cultural matter. I think the Arab Spring, it used to be that many people said, well, the Arabs are different from other people around the world. They don't care about democracy because they're willing to live under these authoritarian governments. Well, I think the Arab Spring has not led to democracy, but it's shown that I don't think the Arabs are any different from anybody else. They don't like to live under bad dictatorships that don't give them opportunities and freedom of choice. And I think the Chinese are no different from this. And this government in China is not going to be any more successful in the long run at keeping up this tremendous rate of growth than any other country in human history. And when that happens, I think there will be an accounting, because there's a tremendous amount of anger there at the polluted air, the fact that you can't trust the baby formula, or you can't eat food safely, or that property is confiscated on a daily basis without any recourse to a real legal system. And so I think the legitimacy of a government still does depend on maintaining that balance between state, law, and accountability. And I think that it's our job in countries that aspire to be democracies to constantly think about that balance and to make sure that those institutions are there, because without the institutions, I don't think that you get to a modern society that really unlocks the potential of its citizens. So, thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to questions. Okay, I sit here?
I think you should stand up here.
Okay.
Thank you so much for this exciting intellectual speech, Frank. Now we have a half an hour for a discussion, and I'll try to help you with picking up the questions. You probably should stay here. We have Alexandra on the right and Radoslava on our left, and I will ask them to help with the mics in order for those people who are watching us online having a possibility to hear your questions. And also I would ask those people who are raising their hands to introduce themselves before the question. So please, the floor is open, and I ask you for the questions. Okay, we have one here, please.
Юлія Щегельська, Institute of Journalism, PhD in Political Sciences. I would like to ask you about Arab Spring. How do you think, what reason unite people together and make them forced to cooperate as one whole. People who mostly doesn't have the internet, and also people which live in a country, in countries that totally control mass media.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the question is about the Arab Spring. So I think that the Arab Spring had its origin, an origin that was very similar to other revolutions elsewhere. It was really led by middle-class people that were more educated, had gone to college, had access to technology. And I think that a lot of social media like Facebook and Twitter was actually quite important in mobilizing them to come out and protest against Ben Ali in Tunisia or Mubarak in Egypt or in other places. The problem, I think, is that initial impulse and the hatred of dictatorship that it was drawing upon didn't lead to an organization of an alternative form of government. And I think this is one of the great problems that many activists have who are used to opposing tyranny but don't think ahead to the next step of how do we organize for an election, and if we win an election, how do we actually exercise power? What kinds of policies are we going to pursue? And in Egypt in particular, it turned out that there was a group that was much better organized for an election, and that was the Muslim Brotherhood. The other thing I think that's characteristic of the Arab world is that religion is an alternative mobilizing ideology, kind of alternative to democracy. Now, I think there's actually a counterpart in Europe, because as Western Europe democratized in the 19th century, a lot of that democratic impulse was hijacked by nationalism. And so in many countries, you could get people out on the streets not for universal citizen rights, but as Germans or Italians or Frenchmen or so forth. And that was actually the cause really of the two world wars. And so in a similar way, I think in the Middle East, religion becomes a useful mobilizing tool for politicians. And that's the struggle that's now playing out in every one of these countries. The one thing I would say, however, is that if you look at Europe itself, it took 100 years, more than 100 years from the French Revolution until the point that you actually had stable democratic institutions in most European countries. And so I don't think that anyone should be surprised that just a little more than 2 years after the onset of the Arab Spring, things look extremely chaotic and nothing like democracy, because building institutions really takes a long time. It takes a long time, and that's what I hope my lecture tonight was trying to communicate, is that institution building is a very slow process, because there are many institutions, they have to work together, they involve value change and cultural change and the like. So that's why I don't think we should expect quick results.
Yeah, Alexander?
Thanks a lot. Alex Holubov, political science student in Kyiv Mohila Academy and journalist. So you are well known as an author of social capital concept as a trust, I think.
Yes.
One of the fathers, as some our textbooks are writing. The question is, in Eastern Europe, the concept of social capital is quite strongly criticized. A lot of scientists argue that it doesn't work here at all. Are you still believe that it's really important for building, for example, accountable government, as you have told us, and what we have to do in Ukraine, because our level of social capital is, especially in the understanding of trust, is extremely low. So please, do you have any recipe for us, what we have to do?
I think that the single, in some case, so social capital is just the ability of people to work with one another informally, based on shared values and norms, it is oftentimes hard to deliberately create social capital. But the one thing that you can do to promote it, I think, is to create an impartial rule of law. Let me tell you a story. So in Italy, there's this organization called the Mafia. Why does the Mafia exist? The Mafia exists, it didn't always exist in Italy. It really arose in the 19th century because in Sicily and in other parts of southern Italy, there was no state that could administer a fair rule of law, so that if you went into business with somebody and that person cheated you, you couldn't go to the court system and have the court, expect the court to give a fair decision. And so therefore what you did was you hired a mafioso, you know, and the guy would go and he'd threaten your business partner and he'd say, if you don't pay what you owe, I'm going to shoot you in the leg, right? So it was a kind of private enforcement of what should have been a public function. And I think that that's one of the really destructive characteristics of a weak rule of law. If you can't trust the justice system to be impartial in that sense, then you're going to rely on your own resources. So that means you rely on your family, your friends, your close, associates. Those are the only people you can trust. You cannot trust a stranger because there is no impartial way of strangers relating. So I would say that it's really the creation of an independent and fair judicial system that really is the one public institution that a country can create that more than anything else, I think, would establish trust on an individual level between citizens. Yeah, okay, that's fine. Okay.
Glad to see you there. My name is Tatiana Bedruk. I am a student of Kiev Hill Academy, Department of Political Science. I'd like to ask you two questions. First, could you predict the future process of democratization in Ukraine for next 7 years? And second, does it really possible in all these conditions?
I'm sorry, can I predict what?
The future process of democratization in Ukraine for next 7 years.
No, I can't predict it. But let me, though, just make one observation. And again, this relates to why I was telling you all these historical stories, all right? So I told you this story of the rise of parliamentary government in England. So this was a struggle between, in a sense, the state represented by the king and society that was represented in parliament. And the reason that you got constitutional government at the end of this struggle was that there was a relative balance between the state and that society, so that the civil society was well organized enough that it could resist the power of the state and it could demand better performance from the state. And because the state had to tax its citizens, as I said, they really had very powerful leverage over their rulers, and in the end they actually had to take up arms and fight the government. So I would say I don't think anyone in Ukraine should fight the government, but I do think that this struggle for democracy is not going to play out in this country unless the people who want democracy are organized. Organization is, absolutely the key to all of this. And so as long, so it doesn't matter whether 80% of the people, really favor great democratic government, but if they're just individuals, it isn't going to happen. It's just not going to happen. And that means that civil society has to be organized, there has to be the ability to protest, to think, there has to be information. There has to be a flow of knowledge about what the government is doing. And then there has to be a means of holding the government accountable. I mean, elections are one way of doing it, but there are many other forms of accountability that exist in the modern world. So without that organization and without that mobilization, I think that democracy here is not going to happen. And again, before 2004, I think a lot of people said, well, the Ukraine people can't get angry and they don't mobilize and so forth. And I think, what happened that year showed that that wasn't true either. And so I think, future is going to really depend on kind of the will of people to, to make society's views prevail against that of the state. Yes, how about down here?
Victor Tergubov, journalist. I want to ask you, you called 3 elements that we need to achieve to be an effective state. State, rule of law, and accountability. That's actually not a secret for anybody, that's a known elements. But the question is how to achieve it in a faster pace. We have not thousands of years like China, we have no thousands of years like Germany. The only question is how we can overcome our strong traditions of corruption, how we can overcome our strong traditions of paternalism and so on.
Well, that's really a subject of a separate lecture, and it would have to be one that was, tailored to the conditions of Ukraine. But you can see some of the elements of the path forward in some of the things I've said. So that, for example, education is critical. The more education you have in a society, and the more education of public officials that exist, the better quality government you're going to have. I mean, that's, as I said, that's what the Chinese figured out a long time ago. If you can start appointing more and more public officials on the basis of their technical knowledge and their ability, rather than simply on the basis of political connections, you're going to have a higher quality government. Accountability and information are both tools to combat corruption, because citizens don't like corrupt governments, and so if they expose corruption and get knowledge of that out into the public space and then organize to protest, then that creates incentives against corruption. And I think that basically strengthening of the judicial system is absolutely critical. And again, that means that judges and lawyers can't be appointed by the government itself. They have to be independent. They have to have salaries and incomes and training that's separate from what the government wants, so that they can... So see, every one of these solutions that would apply in a place like Ukraine over the next few years actually has a historical precedent. And the nice thing about knowing about history is you don't have to learn these things all for yourself, right? They're, in a certain sense, there's a package. And then I guess the final thing is what I would call the middle class coalition, because, deeply entrenched corruption is very unjust. It makes a few people extremely wealthy, and it holds back the fortunes of everybody else in the society. The reason that it persists is that the people that are hurt by corruption are not organized. They're not well organized. And I think if you look at the history in the United States or in Britain or in other places to defeat deeply entrenched corruption, it's a political struggle. It's a political struggle against by people who, a coalition of people that want a different kind of government to force change on a legal level and on a political level. In the United States, this really happened in the late 19th century, and it took, it took a long time. In Britain, it was a little bit easier to do for various reasons. But you have to think politically about these things. These are not just things that will happen as a result of economic growth or modernization. People are agents, This is what Karl Marx got wrong, because he thought that just, economic change by itself would produce social classes and different kind of politics. That's not right. You know, individuals have control over their lives, they make decisions, and if they don't make the right decisions, you're not going to get the right sort of politics. And so I think all of those, you know, together, you know, can produce change in a place like this.
Yes, sir. Can we ask a question from Bob here? Okay. Can we ask a question from Bob?
Yeah. Oh, please. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. We're all glad to see you here. My name is Sergey Kuzmin. I'm a representative of the Faculty of Cybernetics of our Kyiv National University. And I have the following question. So I would like to ask you about building democracy, right? So actually in terms of Arab Spring and in terms of Syria, should we think about military intervention as a key element in building democracy? Because a lot of countries actually, they don't support that way, right? A lot of countries reject those things which are, you know, taken to the public by the United States or England or, you know, other countries which actually support it, right? So, because if we look at military intervention, it's a way of forcing some society to accept democracy, right? If they are not ready for it, if they don't want it, should we do it? Thank you.
Well, I don't think that democracy was ever built through military intervention. You know, I think that the Bush administration, when it invaded Iraq, basically invaded Iraq because they thought they had weapons of mass destruction, which then turned out not to be the case. And I think they used democracy after the fact as a way of justifying their action when it turned out that there are no weapons of mass destruction. But I don't think anyone seriously believes that military intervention is the way to build democratic societies. Democratic societies, by definition, have to be the result of choices made by the citizens that live in that society. Now, what's going on in Syria right now, I don't think has anything to do with democracy. I mean, I think President Obama managed to box himself into this situation because, you know, I think the international community does have an interest in certain kinds of weapons not being used. We don't want chemical, biological, nuclear weapons to be used, and so it's reasonable for the international community to say, you know, there ought to be certain sanctions against the use of certain kinds of weapons. That's not about democracy. That's more of a, you know, a humanitarian or a human rights kind of issue. The problem is that the use of force in any given situation, whether it's wise or not, very much depends on the specifics of the situation. In this particular case in Syria, it's a very difficult decision to make because I don't think that there's clearly good guys and bad guys on the two sides of this civil war. I mean, I think Assad is not a good guy, but there's also, you know, a lot of jihadists and a lot of, you know, extremists on the side that's fighting him. And one of the great dangers of any kind of military action is that it's going to lead to unpredictable consequences. And so it's really not clear what's going to, you know, be the result of an American military strike. But I do think that the international community does have a general interest in, you know, having general rules against the use of certain kinds of weapons, and to the extent that those can be enforced through an international consensus, I think that's better. But the issue, you know, in Syria right now really isn't democracy, I think. Yes, how about up there?
We have two most crowded venues today in Kyiv. It's Institute of Journalism and also Stadium.
Yeah.
Alexander Kantanchev, Master of International Economy. So, talking about social mobilization, what do you think about United Nations Development Program? Could it be effective to start from below, to start to change people's mentality, not to change some institutional part of state. So.
Well, I'm not quite sure what you mean by the United Nations Development Program, because it's an agency that has a lot of different programs under its wing.
So they started to develop small villages to give a chance for communities to get some investments to make some infrastructure programs inside that communities. So they create these programs and they start to develop it into something bigger. So,
are you talking about Jeffrey Sachs's Millennium Village program? I mean, that was sponsored by the United Nations. I mean, there's development agencies do a lot of different things, and it kind of depends on what the specific program is.
Okay, it was just an example. So I'm talking about a development from below, from small communities, from small villages and small cities. It will starting to change mentality of these villages. Could be effective, not to start from higher structures, not starting from government, starting just from people.
Well, I don't think that any of these grassroots kinds of programs, they can help in certain respects where you get this kind of grassroots mobilization where citizens can monitor the government, report corruption, this sort of thing. But I don't think that any country has ever developed simply on the basis of, purely spontaneous grassroots movements like this. I think that a lot of times, if you look at South Korea or China or other countries that have been very successful at economic development, it really did require having a certain institutional structure there. And in fact, I think that one of the biggest insights that development economists have had over the last generation is that institutions matter, that if you don't get the politics right, so for example, if you have an African country with a highly corrupt president and a political elite that basically wants to divide up the riches of the country and share it between themselves, it doesn't matter how much mobilization you have at a village level. That country is never going to develop. And so I think you really do have to fix a lot of the central institutions. Now, if the mobilization is a mobilization of people to produce that kind of institutional change, then maybe you're talking about something, that will be more durable. But I don't think that, real development has ever come simply from, a lot of dispersed people acting, independently in a lot of different places. Last question, okay. Yes, how about in the middle? Yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Dmitro Pleshakov from the Institute of Journalism. Got a question about the Chinese model. You've said that it can't survive in far future because it doesn't provide the middle class with the ability, with opportunity to influence in the government. However, the Chinese people, they have ability to take part in Communist Party and as a result to get higher in this system because the system is rather fair, you said, because it's a tradition of China, And then why isn't that enough to be a stable state that will survive in far future? Because people have some
so, well, first of all, the Chinese Communist Party is tiny with respect to the size of China. So, it's basically a ruling elite. It's a self-selecting ruling elite. And one of the big questions, I think, that they have to face is how do they guarantee that this elite is public-spirited and picks the right policies? In Chinese history, the one big defect of their traditional system is what the Chinese themselves call the bad emperor problem, right? So if you have a good emperor under a Chinese-style system, everything will be great, You'll have rapid decision-making, it'll be decisive, the emperor will be beneficial to the whole society, but there's no institutional way of guaranteeing that you will always have good emperors. You'll always have a supply of good emperors. And this is, I think, the fundamental defect of that kind of an authoritarian system, that there's no clear way of reproducing a public-spirited, benevolent, dictator or elite. And I think that's true of the Communist Party as of any other authoritarian government. A lot of Chinese would say the last bad emperor we had was Mao Zedong, and he was terrible. He was responsible for the deaths of tens, if not hundreds of millions of people. And that's why I think basically you need constitutional government, because authoritarian systems can produce very good results for a certain length of time, but because there are no checks on power, they can produce absolutely awful results as well. And that's, I think the problem with the current Chinese system. All right? Okay, very last
question. Thank you very much, Professor Fukuyama. My last question is
How about, okay, one more here.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
You said a lot about institutions, which Ukraine needs a lot, and now Ukraine on the crossroad of Euro or I could say other integration with other unions. What do you think? Could Euro integration help Ukraine to improve these institutions? Could some integrations help other countries to improve democracy, improve economic development, improve social development?
Absolutely. Ukraine does not have any choice for its future other than integrating with Europe. First of all, accession to the European Union has been a powerful driver of reform in other parts of Eastern Europe. But look at the alternative, You look at the alternative. The alternative union is a union that's built on gas and oil and kleptocratic politics. And I think that, that as a future for Ukraine is a disaster. So I think that there's no choice. Ukraine has no choice but to continue to build rule of law and democracy in partnership with Europe and with other Western countries like the United States. It's going to be a slow and difficult process, but the form of the institutions that you need is pretty much clear. And I think if you make the right choices, you'll get help in doing that. So there's no alternative.
Dear Mr. Fukuyama, we are grateful.
Okay.
Please.
Okay.
We are grateful that you have visited the Institute of Journalism and spoken in front of the audience of hundreds of students. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.